When our children tell our story, they'll tell the story of tonight. If you've watched Hamilton or heard the soundtrack, this is a line from one of the early songs in the show. It's just after Hamilton meets Lafayette, Mulligan, and Lawrence, and they begin to talk seriously of revolution. Now, I love this show. Years before I got to see it on Disney Plus, I listened to the soundtrack over and over. For me, the entire show is about the legacy we leave. Now, I know some of you are thinking, now, Reverend Tracie, it's about the American Revolution and Alexander Hamilton. Well, yeah, sure, that too. But the whole story underneath that is about the importance of legacy. Who is left to tell our stories and how those stories can change? The title of today's sermon is from Hamilton as well. There's a line that goes, "You have no control. Who lives, who dies, and who tells your story." Legacy. Who tells our stories and how do we hear them? Are the stories that we're living ones we've been told or ones we actually witnessed and remember? There's a saying that goes, history is written by the victors. And we're learning that as we do our anti-racism and anti-oppression work and start listening to Black, Indigenous, and people of color tell us their stories and their histories. It's sobering work to see how in most cases it is widely different than the tales we heard in school. Now, I would like you to humor me for a moment. Think about a funny story you'd tell me about your past if we were sitting down and having a cup of coffee. A story that helps me get to know you. Now, I want you to pause and hold on to that memory. Is it your memory? Or is it a story you were told? What do I mean? Well, let me illustrate with one of my favorite stories about me and my dad. He was taking an at-home electronics course when I was a kid, and I would help him by identifying the color bands on the little tiny resistors that he would then solder onto the board. Well, one night we were working, and he realized that we'd need to go back to Radio Shack to buy more of a certain resistor. And that may help some of you date this story. It was the weekend or something, so we wouldn't be able to go shopping for a day or two. Now, the next day while my dad was at work, I went into the garage and found an old TV. I used my handy-dandy toolbox that my dad gave me at 5 years old to pop the back off, pull out an electric board, find the resistors my dad needed, and pop them off with a flathead screwdriver and a pair of snips. And I proudly went to him that night and showed him that I had solved the problem. And he started to get upset, but my mom simply said, "You created this monster. You can't get mad at her." Now, sweet story, right? I love it. I just don't remember it. I remember working with my dad on the resistors and his homework, and I have no doubt that I would have done that. I was taking my bedroom furniture apart at 5 because my dad did give me my own real toolbox. But I don't remember if I tore apart the broken TV. It could be true. Now, that's an innocuous story, one that lines up with who I was as a child, curious, persistent, and who I am now, still persistent and still curious. But what if it wasn't? I can think of about 20 stories I've been told about my childhood, and by extension, myself, that I don't remember and aren't quite as funny and sweet. They're ones that fit a narrative that others wish to tell me about me. And perhaps you can as well. Who tells your story? I'm going to bring us out of the individual aspect of this. So while yes, it's important and says a lot about each of us, we are also part of a collective. And together, each of you with your own stories come together to create this community with its collective story. And those stories get intertwined and added to and form the legacy of this community. So what's the story of this congregation? Not just your founding, although that is important. You see, the way congregations come together in their early days lay down the DNA of the congregation. There are endless reports out there about how a congregation will do certain things or not do certain things, and no one really knows why. And you come to find out through digging through their history that these things were done or not early in the founding. Never mind that no one who founded the congregation was even alive anymore. No one knew the story, but it still lived on. Or there are other cases. I remember my first time in a Unitarian Universalist congregation. Seriously, it was my very first visit. And I was chatting with people after service, and someone told me this story about how the church nearly split over a previous minister. And I was shocked, and I asked, well, when did that happen? Folks, it had been 5 years. 5 years since that happened, and this person told me the story like it had happened yesterday. And reminded it was being told to a visitor on her first time there. This story was so embedded in who they were, they couldn't help themselves from repeating it to everyone and reliving it. It affected everything. 3 years later, when I left to go to seminary, it was still affecting things. And it was a deep grief that had never been really dealt with. And because of that, it hung around like a pallor on the place. I've seen it play out in other congregations. Congregations that started from a split, regardless of whether it was healthy or not. Congregations that had misconduct, whether from ministers, staff, or members. Congregations that had devastating loss of people or of their building due to disaster. Or congregations that can't understand why they aren't attracting and keeping new members. Chances are there's a story about who is actually welcome. These stories get embedded into our culture as a congregation, and it colors everything we do, every decision we make. You might have heard the symptoms of it. Well, we tried that before and bad things happened. Or, well, we don't talk about things like that. Or, well, we just don't seem to be the place for that demographic of members. Who tells your story? Keep in mind, too, your stories don't just stay with you. They're told about you to others. Much like our stories of our childhood, other people will tell these stories about you. Maybe they're true, maybe they're not, but you can't control who tells your story. Are the stories about your congregation ones that you collectively here now, lived through, and actually remember? Or are they ones passed down by others? Have they, much like the story with my dad, been told to you so many times that you just assume they're true? Let's say they are. Let's say that the stories you tell yourselves about yourself are true and remembered correctly. Are these stories helping you move forward to the future you want now? Or are they holding you back and keeping you in a framework that your congregational ancestors wanted? If they're helping you move forward, great. Share those stories with each other. Keep them going. Let those foundations grow stronger. Write them down. Share them with new members. Share them with old members. Celebrate them and add to them as you make new stories. If they're holding you back, then it's time to begin telling new stories. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that it's a time to lie or embellish. You can't change what has already happened, but you can move forward. You start by being honest with yourselves collectively as a congregation, and this isn't just a job for leadership, it's a job for everyone. It means looking at places in your history, however far back, noting where mistakes were made, where people were hurt, and figure out if any things can be fixed. Possibly not, especially if it was a while back. But sometimes it just begins by saying, our congregational ancestors made mistakes here. We recognize that has affected who we have been and who we are today. And we're committed to making things better. Then, of course, you have to correct the things that may be ingrained deep without you realizing it. You may have to apologize to people who have been hurt. You may have to just apologize in general without being able to speak to those people because they're gone. You may have to offer and or accept forgiveness. This work is hard, and it is holy. It is no different than the work we're being called to do in anti-racism and anti-oppression, to recognize choices that were made in our collective past, state them, and work towards change, even if, especially if, we did not cause that pain. It's as simple as saying, even though my ancestors weren't here in America when these horrible things happened, I have benefited from them. I'm sorry, and I'm working to make changes in what I do to affect real change. Can't change what we don't recognize. And much like how our congregational DNA runs so deep that no one who is currently in a congregation may know what happened many years ago, but they feel the effects, changes you make starting today can affect the DNA of your congregation for years to come. You may never know what this congregation will be in 10, 20, 30, 50 years from now. That's the beauty and the heartbreak of our stories. We don't control who tells our story or how they tell it. All we can hope to do is lay a foundation that gives us a good legacy. Going back to Hamilton for a moment, in the final number of the musical, they're wrapping up all the storylines and sharing both Alexander and Eliza Hamilton's stories. George Washington sings this line: "What is a legacy? It's planting seeds in a garden you'll never see." I encourage you to do some gardening, friends. It means continuing to tend to the seeds and plants that are growing strong and healthy. It means digging up the ones that are choking the life out of the garden. It means planting new seeds by telling new stories about who you are meant to be, not just who you were. You may not be able to control who tells your story, but you can help them by laying a framework for good stories about you. What will your children say about your story? What will they say about how you lived your Unitarian Universalist values? When they tell the story of this time, what will they say about your congregation and how it lived within the community? I don't know the answers to that. The answers are up to you. I encourage you to let this be one of the sermons y'all chew on for a while. And if there's work to do, get curious and dig in. What stories have you been telling yourselves about yourselves? Regardless of what kind of stories they are, you can work right now in creating new stories to share and tell and plant those seeds for your legacy. Amen. Blessed be, and may it be so.